So let me bring out our guests. Two filmmakers. They had their world premiere yesterday of The Truth About Killer Robots. Please welcome director Maxim Pozdorovkin and producer and cinematographer Joe Bender.
Thank you.
So as you know, by way of background of introducing Maxim and Joe, they have made many films before. Earlier this year, they made the film Our New President, which compiled footage out of Russian state television. Largely, it played here at Hot Docs in April. Max also made the film Pussy Riot, A Punk Prayer, and The Notorious Mr. Boot. Both great films. So in their new film, The Truth About Killer Robots, they are looking at ways in which robots have been responsible for human deaths, but that's the kind of entryway into the story. Another big part of the film is the way robots and automation kill jobs, and the way in which robots become more human-like and humans become more robotic-like. I think that everyone, when they think about automation and the loss of jobs, might think first about factory work, or then maybe you think about the service industry and the way you used to check out at the drugstore with a human being, and now it's with a touchscreen TV. And it's probably quite natural, for us to think, well, if I work in the creative industry, that can't be replaced by a robot. Surely a robot can't program the Toronto Film Festival. And part of this discussion I wanted to have today from conversations that I've been having with Max and Joe over the summer is the way technology is in small and large ways getting more and more, becoming more and more part of the process of filmmaking. So we're going to explore that. But to begin with, I want to talk a little bit about the film, The Truth About Killer Robots. I mean, Maxime, maybe you could just set up for us what drew you to the subject and how you approach it in the film.
I think I'll start with just the idea of the approach. I think that for me, I've always very keenly felt that I'm not a journalist, and I don't have the temperament to be a journalist, and I don't have the training, anything. And so when I approach a film, but obviously if you're making a documentary, you have to be in dialogue with, you have to be educated, you have to know what you're talking about. So I often try to, when making a film, I try to look at what's already written and kind of presented as the dominant narrative, and see what inevitably the blind spots are in these kinds of things. And in the last few years, there's just been tons and tons of articles about basically that robots are going to kill us. And there's books. There's a great book called Our Final Invention. There's a few movies. But what I noticed looking at all of them is that almost all of them are just told exclusively in the voice of the technology owners, of the programmers, of the CEOs who own it. And it's almost, a lot of them have the kind, like a lot of the ones that touch about the dangers of robotics have this feeling like preemptive apology for the way that their toys may one day destroy us and kill us. And also it kind of focuses exclusively on sort of the numbers involved. Whereas our motto from the very beginning in choosing this film, and this is when initially we started by going to the Volkswagen factory when we heard about this incident where a worker who was installing a robot was crushed to death. And we started talking to the workers there, and very soon we confronted that the issue, even though there was kind of a small cover-up happening and the Volkswagen factory didn't know how to handle the optics of what happened, and the workers were told not to talk to anyone about it, there was still this kind of discomfort, but the discomfort from a worker was much more about the labor issues. So we wanted to try to make this film which was about, literal death as a result of robots, and then the sort of metaphorical death by automation, and as a way of looking not just at AI, but the whole process of automation, of which AI is a culmination. So starting, as Tom was saying, with manufacturing, going through the service sector, and then other more humanistic, philosophical instances of displacement.
Well, we have a clip from near the beginning of The Truth About Killer Robots. It references this Volkswagen death. It's not a graphic clip, so don't be afraid. Let's roll clip number 1 from The Truth About Killer Robots. Joe, as I'm watching that, made me wonder, the footage you have of the robots on the assembly line, did you acquire that or did you shoot it?
We acquired a lot of that footage from inside the factory because those are spaces that are just not
off limits,
readily accessible.
Yeah.
Although, I mean, that was a really great part of the film, was getting to film shoot a lot of these robotic systems in other parts of the film, and you know, it's a big challenge catching all that movement and these strong geometric forms. They're really beautiful.
Yeah. So I want to extract from you both, thinking that you've had about the ways in which robotics technology are affecting the way we all make movies. I think an obvious example that we all have felt in the last 8 years is the use of drones in shooting from high angles. And the first time I remember seeing a drone was in 2010 in Werner Herzog's Cave of Forgotten Dreams. Yeah. And now, of course, they're prevalent. You make a lot of use of them. But beyond drones, there are many other ways in which I've heard you describe. So I just kind of want to go through the process of making a film and different points along the way where you see technology changing some of the way these things are done. Joe, you and I were talking about pre-production more affecting fiction films than in nonfiction films. But can you describe the way technology is shaping that experience?
Yeah. So I mean, one of the really big ways that you see this in narrative, and I mean, I think that it's just a matter of time before this makes an appearance into documentary too, as the technology becomes more readily accessible. But is advanced pre-visualization in software using gaming engines to essentially set up scenes ahead of time so that you can, virtually enact. So
whereas we used to draw storyboards for a scene, close-up, medium shot, reverse angle, what you're saying is that the technology that we're familiar with from video games, the kind of three-dimensional looking at a scene, is getting affordable enough and easier to manipulate. So what Alfred Hitchcock used to do on storyboards, if he was alive today, he might be doing with a 3D modeling.
Yeah, absolutely. And like NVIDIA just launched this new line of graphics cards with this tensor engine that's really bringing machine learning to the desktop. And so I think it's only a matter of time before the texture shading and lighting rendering becomes so good that we start seeing reenactments in documentary, for example, that are virtually constructed scenes that might allow us to sort of visualize things that would be impossible to photograph.
Mm-hmm. I just saw, actually, this is in a Russian news kind of documentary. I saw they started using deep fakes, which is basically taking a historical photograph of someone, Lenin, Stalin, whoever, and then putting words into their mouth and sort of animating the photograph. But it's but pushing off of an archival photograph in a way that's still, I think, a little bit taboo in like PBS or even TIFF. I don't know. I haven't seen it done in a documentary.
Well, it does remind me, there was a film about Marlon Brando, the title of which is, I'm forgetting, just a couple of years ago, and Marlon Brando had eventually done a kind of sculpting of his face.
Mm-hmm. Well, they did the death mask, right, of Brando?
Exactly.
But it
it's a kind of, hologram-like image, and they could put words into Brando's mouth with, you would not mistake it for Marlon Brando. It looked like a kind of graph-like of his face, but all the same. Yeah. The two of you earlier did this film, Our New President, where you were processing hundreds, if not thousands, of hours of Russian state television and other archival sources. How did technology come into play for that level of research?
Well, just, the ability of just, in dealing, we've all been living through sort of a database logic, and the idea is that right now you can start to think about how you can make a movie sort of pushing off from the idea of a database. Ultimately, you know, most websites, the New York Times, YouTube, is a database that we search through. And so the idea is that we knew, for example, in that, there the premise of a movie to see if you could make a movie that tells the story of Trump, a story that we all kind of know, entirely out of false statements. So use Russian news to tell a story that's entirely false. Out of, you know, make a story out of
a factual story out of false statements.
Out of false statements, exactly. And so you have switched gears to the new movie.
And you've lost your lines.
Yeah, and then working with that kind of, you know, it's the kind of material that we were able to amass is unthinkable in the old days. Like you would just need houses full of storage, you know, given how much film stock there was. And even as is, we have so many hard drives of it. But being able to actually effectively work through, especially with transcription services that you can get through voice recognition that even YouTube has built in, the ability to download a lot of these videos, to catalog them, just makes it possible to ingest the same kind of, you know, absurd amounts of footage, even as a filmmaker.
Can you get a little bit more into those tools? So you accumulate hundreds of hours off of YouTube of, say, Russia Today network, and when you needed to go find, like, you know, when are they talking about Hillary Clinton? Is that still a human task, or can it be sped up by tools?
Oh, it can definitely be sped up, and you know, to jump back a bit, like a lot of times when we talk about big data, they will do these kinds of analysis where they'll use big data to figure out, like in Renaissance painting, what percentage did they use of these colors, that colors, and those colors. So they have a distribution of a color palette in Renaissance painting. And they can analyze, you know, hundreds of thousands of paintings in a way that no historian could be able to do. And that's a very kind of traditional way of using kind of machine learning or using big data to work with aesthetic materials. By the fact that a lot of these things, a lot of, let's say, videos are keyworded, they're tagged, a person that has kind of an intuitive sense of working with the Google algorithm, you could really work to organize, to be able to pull things, to be able to pull events. You know, we were dealing with 1.5 years of several channels producing maybe 6 or 7 hours of content every single day. So yeah, we could be able to generate transcripts. The idea that you can even bounce transcripts and bounce subtitle files and transform them. I mean, the ability to transform things into a text file is really so radical when you're, again, when you started dealing with such massive amounts of material.
So if you take 7 hours of Russian television, you translate it from Russian to English, and then you can do a word search on Hillary Clinton to find out at what point of those 7 hours they were talking about Hillary Clinton.
Right, and yeah, I mean, you could work. Yeah,
and the next step of that is having all that automated keywording and tagging move to actually being able to pre-edit, essentially to populate a timeline with all of the sentences in which someone talks about Hillary Clinton or references a particular word or phrase, and or emotional analysis of people's speech.
What an AE would often do as a rough assembly, for example.
Right. Right. So one of the ways in which you use technology in this film is that you have a robotic voice to narrate your film. I mean, the conceit of the film is that it is being narrated by a robot. And we're going to look at the second clip I have, and I'm not sure if it has some of the robot narration or not, but you will get a sense of a robot on screen. So let's look at clip number 2 from The Truth About Killer Robots. So we didn't hear any of the actual narration in the film there, but as I was saying before, you used a robotic voice as the narrator, and it must have made re-scripting easier, because in the traditional way, you'd have to have a fine cut of your film, have it all scripted out, and then, you know, go to, if you're using a narrator who's not yourself, go in and get them. And once you've recorded Morgan Freeman narrating your film, if you want to rewrite a line, that's not going to happen again.
Right. You know, and I think that for us, the biggest sort of blind spot that we discovered also immediately was one that was perpetuated by artists. You know, and a lot of the techniques that we talked about earlier, the drone techniques, a lot of automation techniques, they can sort of, to people who are not familiar with film language, they can remain sort of invisible. And for us, the tip of the iceberg was this, just having, you know, an android narrate the film, outright because the android that we use was specifically created to be a voiceover robot. And the idea is that, as you said, working with that was much easier, but also it was a way of us to just engage.
And let me just ask you, the voice that you're using, is it...
it's Amazon Poly, but which we treat with reverb and then work, with pronunciation. And you could, and again, if you're making a voiceover film, a film that has voiceover, you're constantly rewriting it to the last moment. And it was so much more, it's cheaper, it's free. And then even for commercial use, and then you can you can tweak it, you can work.
You don't have to pay residuals.
No,
right, but it does introduce the issue where like a lot of these text-to-speech services are being geared toward applications where bare comprehension is the main thing, whereas with the film we wanted it to express oftentimes the nuance of the language that we were that we're using for the voiceover, and so there was an additional challenge of working with the constraints of this mechanical system to really get it to be expressive.
There's a very funny example of that where we have a line in the film that the robot has to deliver. It says, "A robot is a machine that performs the task automatically with human-like skill." Now, for some reason, Amazon Poly is not able to say skill and have it sound properly and sound correctly. So the workaround that we came up with, it says, perform a task with human likes kill. And that worked. But you mentioned earlier this idea that so oftentimes we perpetuate, a lot of times films made about technology and automation start out by setting out this really, really high benchmark, whether it's an existential danger or it's can a robot direct a film? Can a robot be a cinematographer for a film? Can it edit a film? There are all these things being tried, and in a way what that does is actually just take your eye off the way that the lower levels of automation of these processes are actually transforming us. And for us the significance was, okay, what does it matter that we've lost spatial orientation or memory? It has to affect us somehow, and we all know this. We all know that technology is...
So when you say that we've lost spatial orientation, elaborate what you mean.
Well, in terms of how dependent we are, let's say, on our phones for orientation in a city, or, and those kinds of things, and how much, we outsource that kind of dependency. So, in the second section of the film, it's about the service sector, and it begins with the line that the automation of the service sector required your trust and cooperation. So, it's us entering into these transactional relationships with iPods at pharmacies and at airports and everywhere else. So we're assisting. It's us, willing to lose a few people in driverless car accidents and doing all these things and kind of, destabilize a certain part of, let's say, of the labor market. So, I don't know. We don't engage in that.
And it also redistributes skills and redistributes the way that we spend our energy. Like just talking about drones again, it used to be that operating a drone, you'd have to really work very, very hard to move it in space and also to frame a good shot, make sure that your focus is correct, and get the right kind of movement. But as those...
We used to have to hire a fucking helicopter.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, but this development is happening so quickly that with every generation, the hovering is better, the movement is better, and so then you're able to reallocate your attention to other aspects of the image capture.
But like our motto is that it's more than the numbers, and also we're trying to kind of, there's this kind of constant de-skilling that's happening, and when we look at like a truck driver, for example, the truck driver is there, but what they're actually doing is so minimal that any kind of human dignity that was tied up with with having a skill set is completely sapped. And so a lot of times, even people will ask about, okay, so why are the job numbers at this amount? Or it's like, well, because the economy is very complicated and it can adapt people and it can create low-level jobs. But the thing that always gets lost when you focus exclusively on the numbers is precisely sort of a more existential questions about, just what humans get out of working in terms of, personal satisfaction. And it's really easy to forget that, especially if you're a filmmaker or if you have a good job and you're not really thinking about people that do repetitive jobs and for whom maybe working in a factory alongside other people is significantly better than, just being surrounded by the din and clatter of industrial robots.
Mm-hmm. So, Joe, let's talk about the area of cinematography. You did the cinematography on this film. besides drones, what are other ways in which you see technology changing the job of cinematography?
Yeah, well, I think that one of the really big ways is, again, like a lot of these innovations shift decisions farther down the production process and into post. So even with like very high resolution cameras, we're deferring, well, it's allowing us to plan to have multiple shots out of a single frame, but it also is deferring some of those decisions farther down the line into post. And looking into the future.
Meaning, if we were covering this panel in an old method and you wanted to have cutaway shots, you'd probably need 2 to 3 cameras. You'd have one camera getting a wide shot of us, another camera getting close-ups, and what you're saying with the high-resolution camera, you could have one camera getting a wide shot of us, and then if we wanted a close-up of Joe, you would just within that frame move in on Joe.
Right, and then farther down the line, we're looking. There are things coming like light field photography and volumetric capture that actually allow you to capture all of the surfaces and the objects in a scene.
So let me ask you to elaborate on that phrase, volumetric capture.
Sure. So volumetric capture is when you have a very large array of cameras that are capturing like all of the surfaces of all of the objects in a room. So imagine that there is a ring of 24 cameras around this room. They are capturing the 3 of us from all angles with depth data. So then they're able to project us as 3D objects into a virtual space with high resolution detail of our surfaces. And then you can have virtual cameras in that space that are re-photographing us. So you can have, crane moves and otherwise impossible shots. And so that actually, so when I think about like what are the real threats to cinematography as a profession, that's sort of one of the horizons when like we're actually just capturing everything. We don't have to make any of those decisions. Yeah. So it's not about me and my emotion and my analysis of a scene and deciding what I want to focus on, whether I want depth of, what kind of depth of field, how I want to structure the lighting. I'm just going to instead we're just going to capture everything and then make all those decisions later. And that's
ultimate de-skilling. I mean, that's the same thing that happens to pilots and truck drivers, and that's why for us, we wanted to have that in the film.
Right.
Well, actually, and one note on the resolution issue is also, like, I think I talked to you about this. Francis Ford Coppola recently wrote this book about his experiments with live cinema, which is basically him thinking that since 8K resolution is basically here and it will come, what sort of things can you do working with actors live, where you would essentially be filming everything and then having the backdrops constantly changing as a result of these resolutions. So basically having an element of live theater thought through as a consequence of these kinds of resolution potential. So I think that a lot of these kinds of shifts will happen, and we can see new genres and new articulations of how film is made, both fiction film and documentary.
Moving into the post-production field, there have existed for a long time different tools that can manipulate the way an image looks or manipulate the sound editing. But what I understand from talking to you guys is those tools get more and more sophisticated. Can you talk about some of the changes happening there?
I mean, I think Adobe's probably pretty central in this. There's been just a kind of consolidation of a lot of post-production. I think that's what you see with all kinds of automation. It's a consolidation either within one company or within one program where you can do more and more of a capability, so you require less people but more technology.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of really high-quality machine learning enhanced tools that are already available, like
transcription was one.
Like Isotopes has these audio repair tools for denoising audio and so on that are vastly more sophisticated than they were even a few years ago. But then there are things like content-aware fill for video, where you can, instead of, if I want to remove an object from a scene, instead of having to have a number of VFX artists painting out all of those pixels.
Like Stalin used to have to do, right?
Right, totally.
That's a whole industry.
Yeah, I could just have a program that I can just select the object and it'll analyze the scene and remove that seamlessly. So those are things that are
and it loops into production as well, because if you're thinking about let's say you have a situation where you don't have money or doing something on spec, and you have to make decisions about sound. you may make a decision saying that, okay, I'll risk it because these tools become available. Likewise with resolution, likewise with shooting multiple cameras. And it's really hard to get out of that cycle because, as filmmakers or as, business owners or as anything else.
Are there other areas that I'm not asking you about because they haven't come to my mind that where you're seeing new developments in technology?
Well, I think farther down the line with what I was talking about before with volumetric capture, one of the things that we'll see, and I think that this will probably start in sports and then move into reality in some of these other areas that have very fast turnarounds, but also what will be customizable experiences that are edited by algorithms. If I'm watching a sports game, for example, I'm logged in through an app that knows what my fantasy teams are, and so I'll have a broadcast that's tailored to me by an algorithm.
Right, so if it's two teams, if it's the Detroit Lions playing the Dallas Cowboys, if you're a Detroit Lions fan, maybe you can watch with more close-ups on your team and
on the players that I'm interested in who are on my fantasy team, and then that'll I think move farther into other kinds of programming, so that the notion of a work being a single thing that everyone experiences in the same way will be eroded or transformed, so that every viewer of a show might experience it differently, might actually see a different edit, one that's tailored to their profile.
And people a lot of times connect this to like fan culture. People rewrite novels with Harry Potter novels and things like that, where I think the people that write about the technology see the technology is growing out of that culture, where basically the initial work is only kind of a catalyst for this whole universe. I think that for me, and this is, I think that definitely on a broad level, one of the more troubling ones coming up is definitely just deep fakes as a thing. Given what we're living through in terms of fake news, knowing that a lot of companies already have enough data to very easily, let's say, have Trump say, anything, anything, or have Obama say anything, but the idea that you can basically create news ads, you can create election ads very easily using very readily available apps and just have candidates say whatever the hell you want and fake that, and we throw that into our environment where there's just so much distrust as is in the media, and then that could feel, I think that that's an effect of automation that could be so profoundly destructive to even our debate and our civil discourse and all those things that.
Well, this is something else that I think you've been thinking about through your last project. Right. Our new president is the role of disinformation in our media landscape.
Right, and and there, I started out also with a similar kind of idea. What is the myopia in our understanding of fake news? And there I felt that you can explain fake news, but when you engage with fake news factually, when you're missing the point. That part of the point is the inconsistency, the disorientation, that feeling that's generated by the overload of stimulation with these kinds of information. And so that film was trying to push that to a sort of absurd extreme and see, but.
Yeah. We've got 10 minutes. We could take some questions. We can bring the lights up, and if you got a question, raise your hand. We'll bring a microphone. Here's a question up front here for these two people who have thought a lot about changing technology. You just actually stand up and.
I'm just wondering about editing, about AI, just with Animoto and stuff like that. That's just the beginning, bare bones. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the future of documentary editing.
I think that, that blind spot that I talked about at the beginning, if you look at it economically, it's literally this across all the arts, is that the arts used to be kind of a bell-shaped curve economically in terms of distribution, and it's moved into a star system distribution where basically very few people make money, and then there's people kind of at the end that own the platforms and do well, whatever, and they make money. And I think that basically that technology inevitably, this idea that you're going to get more done with technology will inevitably just drive that more and more. And we're constantly using, because we're going to use everything that we're able to, because it makes we can make it faster, we're as guilty of it, or it's not guilty even, it's just efficient and smart, because we're going to get it done.
There are so many of these tools that on the near edge allow us to do incredible things. Some of these speech manipulation tools. You could fill in a syllable in somebody's speech just because they flubbed that syllable, and so you can make them clearer or easier to understand. But then farther down the line, you might be able to put words into somebody's mouth that they never said, and that causes all of these really substantial ethical issues. A lot of the AE work is already being, starting to be automated pretty substantially. But all the main tasks of editing, or a lot of that has to do with creating an emotional world of a film. That's something that's much more difficult to replicate. So we'll be able to do more in doing that because our efficiency will be enhanced for a time, but then the kinds of processes and endpoints will change, and then so it's a slippery kind of manifold.
Max, I want to pick up on something you were talking about, the distribution of ideas and film, because in theory, some of this technology should make it should bring down budgets of filmmaking. I mean, now that I can film with a drone, I can get a certain kind of scale of production for a lot less money than back in the days when I'd have to hire a helicopter. And whether it's through any of these technologies we're talking about, me as a lone person should be able to raise the value of my production. Well, and assuming that translates into a better, more commercial film, shouldn't that be democratizing in a way for more voices to get out?
I think that's sort of the impulse that we have, and I think that impulse that we have is sort of this voice of techno-optimism, and whereas if I think it probably, at least what the data tells us, is that there's a certain end of a spectrum for where it's true that certain voices are being heard, but then if you look at, for example, budgets in lower content things, in like 5-minute television spots and all these things, the people who are hiring that are also aware of all that technology, or maybe there's a slight lag between supply and demand, so they're aware of it, so they're going to also use it to their advantage to not hire people to, and you see that a lot. I think that certain productions, they don't. Especially large production companies, they don't think that a director exists, that you can do basically a producer and then having an editor and staff and a field producer, and between those you can, So I think that's the effect that it's having. It drives budgets down. It drives budgets down, and it makes, again, it sucks that middle out of the economic curve.
Okay. Who has the microphone back there?
Hi, my name's Jeff Mitchell. I'm a film critic, but I also worked in an office for a long time. Mm-hmm. So in terms of software development, years ago we'd have people doing spreadsheets and working all day, and now we have programs that do all of that. Also, a lot of times in companies, we'll train folks overseas and send jobs overseas, so it's all to lower costs. So are there some surprises in your film about office jobs and basically technology taking over that sector?
Yeah, for us, I think people have a question. I think so, yeah. I think that for us, one of the biggest surprises was the scene where we have a lawyer, which is a guy who really didn't like lawyers very much. He went to Berkeley Law School, went through it, and then he got a corporate law job, and then really saw it in with this takedown mentality that he was doing it during the day, and then at night he would write programs and he would kind of automate his own job. But then he got into this conundrum where he was still submitting this work which was AI generated, but lawyers bill by the hour. So as a result, he had to either posit that he was a Superman and could just produce, could bill 800 hours a week, or what he had decided doing was quitting and starting what started as a joke law firm called Robot, and Wang, which now is real, and then he files. And I think that, but what that gets to is that another thing is when we think about AI, we still tend to think about that big level of general intelligence. And what we're trying to say in the film is that it's actually in small steps, And once those small steps scale, so scale across the legal profession, scale across the service sector much more than it is, then it will become really, really profound. And that shift, that will be kind of an analogous cliff to the cliff described by people like, not Kurzweil because he's an optimist, but Elon Musk or Stephen Hawking or people like that.
Okay, we have time for one or two more questions. I see a hand up here. We'll get you a microphone. Then there's a hand back here. You'll be the next person to get a microphone.
Yeah, hi there. You guys were mentioning a couple of programs. One of them was for sound editing, removing, you're changing vowels or whatever. And, what were the programs that you had mentioned?
Let's see. I'm not going to be. I have to look it up, and I don't have my phone with me. But
Isotope.
oh yeah, Isotope is a software maker that does really, really great audio. Processing plugins for noise reduction and all that kind of thing, but the speech, like changing someone's intonation on a final syllable and so on, it's Vox. Does anyone know off the top of your head? Anyway, I can look it up for you and we can talk after.
All right, back there on the aisle.
Oh, hi. Is this on?
Yes, it is.
My question's about legalities of drone shooting. Mm-hmm. So it's actually a real
That's
scenario.
A great question.
Story of two farmers. So the filmmaker has a $7,000 drone, is hired to shoot this farmer's pictures over this farmer's farm. And in so doing, I guess he maybe ventured across the road over the property of the adjoining farm. And the adjoining farmer shot it down with a shotgun. It's a true story, actually, and it's still unsettled, and nobody knows.
Is this in Canada?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
We thought it was Mississippi when we heard it, but no, it was here in Ontario, yeah. Sorry. So what are the legalities about that?
You did a lot of drone shooting, maybe in...
Not all of it illegal. Oh. But...
Yeah, well, drone operators. I mean, I'm more familiar with the legal framework in the U.S., but you have to be permitted, and to do commercial drone work, you need a commercial pilot's license, and of course, you're then responsible for obeying all airspace restrictions. So that mostly has to do with airports and heliports and important areas of interest like schools and hospitals and so on.
But what about what if a drone flying over my home that is like filming my child in the backyard? It's like,
but that's one of the things we say in the movie is that the regulation is not going to kind of catch up to it. We see all those movies, this year, almost every single documentary has had drone shots. I can almost promise you that almost all of them are illegal, in that sense. And as an example of that, when we were shooting out a drone shot, and we were worried about this very issue. We looked up, and the guy who landed the drone on Obama's White House lawn got a $3,000 fine. So that was the punishment. So, it's not that high.
You put it in the budget.
Well, no, not necessarily. But I mean, I think it's because the technology is so ubiquitous.
The law is far behind.
The law is really far behind, and that's true in legal in terms of culpability for accidents, in terms of all these things, and the companies also will write in things that will make them less culpable, as they will.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there is a presumption of privacy. So if you're not.
Yeah. So to get back to that question, a drone flying over my house.
Technically not allowed.
Technically not allowed.
Yeah.
Right.
Very difficult to enforce.
I think it's probably no different than filming in public in a way. It's a scale issue. It's like in terms of how close you get.
Right. We're out of time here. The next screening of The Truth About Killer Robots is...
Tomorrow at 4, I believe.
Tomorrow at 4 p.m. It was the world premiere here at the festival. We're going to take a half-hour coffee break right now. We'll be back at 3:30 with the team behind The Elephant Queen, the extraordinary film that sold to Apple here at the festival after its world premiere. So please come back at 8:30. Thanks very much to Joe Bender and Maxim Pozdorovkin.